Mr. Andrew Henry William Bruns.
Thank you, Mr. President. In the Commission work programme for 2010, it was said that the European Union must face up to long-term challenges such as globalisation and must regain competitiveness. The problem is that the EU hasn't faced up to globalisation, it's embraced it. It's allowing a flood of imports from developing economies with wage rates a fraction of those in Europe. The only way in which we could possibly regain competitiveness would be to drive wage rates down to their levels. I'm not, of course, even in favour of membership of the European Union. However, even if I were in favour of it, I would accuse its masters of betraying the economic interests of its peoples. I would say that the EU is not so much a European Union as it is a global union, trying to achieve global mobility of all goods and services. I believe that sovereign nation states should rebuild their manufacturing bases and then protect their markets and the jobs of their nationals. Globalisation must be resisted individually or collectively, or it will destroy us all.
Kevin Gallagher, in his new book, The Dragon in the Room, argues that China may have had a positive effect on Latin America in the short term, but in the long run might actually be undermining Latin America's industrialization. Now joining us to talk about all of this is Kevin Gallagher. Thanks for joining us, Kevin.
Thanks for having me, Paul.
So just once again, Kevin teaches at Tufts University at the Global Development and Environment Institute, and he's an associate professor of international relations at Boston University. Okay, so what's the basic concept here?
Basic concept is that the Latin Americans have been bending over backwards to do everything they can to get the Chinese to invest in their economies and to purchase their goods, and they've been very successful at it for the past 10 years. Chinese have been purchasing oil, copper, soybeans, all sorts of primary commodities.
And China's also been helping build refineries, building some infrastructure all connected with getting commodities out of Latin America.
Absolutely. In addition to just purchasing or importing goods from Latin America, they're pouring foreign investment. They've got a stock of foreign investment of $25–30 billion, and it's in oil refineries, copper mines, iron mines, and infrastructure to get the natural resources to Pacific ports and to ship them to China.
Okay, but you're arguing that in the long term, this actually might weaken at least the manufacturing sector, and it sort of make Latin America, a hewer of wood and drawer of water.
Yeah, in the longer run, it could ship Latin America back to the 19th century when it was a primary commodities exporter and had very little growth. Yeah,
now, 30–40 years ago, Latin America was ahead of China in terms of gross domestic product, in terms of exports. So why in 30–40 years has China more or less surpassed Latin America? The Chinese and Latin American economies are kind of around the same size, or at least they were.
Yeah, they weren't, but they are now. China's economy has leapfrogged over, and it is now larger than the entire sum of all the Latin American economies. What's fascinating is that both Latin America and China had the same goal in late 70s, early 80s. They had these inward strategies, and they wanted to integrate with the world economy and quote-unquote globalize, and they took two totally different paths. The Latin Americans took what's called the Washington Consensus. They liberalized trade, liberalized investment, pulled the government out of economic affairs, and thought that foreign investment would flow in and it would help grow their economies.
So a whole wave of privatization of publicly owned companies. Government gets out of the way, supposedly deregulates, allows free flow of capital, and so on.
That was the idea, and the hope was that would grow your economy and take you to the next level. Latin American economies grew at a little over 1% per year in per capita terms since that whole strategy started. Go to China, their economies have been growing 6–7% per capita terms, and they've approached globalization in a totally different way.
The banking system in Latin America, and for that matter the United States, completely private. Very little public mandate, you can say, or planned government strategy, where in China there's a lot of lending going on right now because so much of the banking sector is still in either, if not straightforwardly government owns major shares of the banks.
Sure, most Latin American countries privatized their banks in the 80s and the 90s, and they're owned by foreign companies, usually by Spanish banks, Canadian banks, or US banks. And so to get a loan, if you're a company, you have to get a loan on globally determined interest rates, which have traditionally been relatively high, which has eroded some of the industrial base in the region for a long time. If you can't borrow money internationally, you can't expand. Whereas in China, they have a development bank that's primary goal is to foster the development of small and medium-sized enterprises and to get their big companies out of the country, penetrating markets across the globe. Well, the lesson for all economies is that you can't just retreat the state out of economic affairs, regardless of your level of development. For developing economies, it's really shown that you just can't, especially with China and the world economy right now, you can't just let markets determine your long-run development path. The government has to play a role, has to put together a strategy, and has to think about where you want to be and how you want to get there. But the same can be said about the United States and the developed economies. We've been sitting around letting markets determine how things work, and we've created these huge bubbles that have blown up the world economy.
So what can we do about this? There are several alternatives. They fall into two general categories: actions at the federal level and actions at the state level. There are three basic federal level solutions, all of which have at their core that government should issue and control the quantity of money, and commercial banks can only lend out the money they actually have. British citizen James Robertson splits up the money power between two competing governmental bodies. The British government would publish monetary objectives approved by Parliament, for example, an inflation range of 2 to 3%. Then the Bank of England would create just enough debt-free money to achieve those objectives. It would then give this money to the government to spend into the economy by the normal budgetary process. Commercial banks would still be in operation, but could only lend out the money they have. Then they would have to compete for additional money on the open market, just as other corporations have to compete in the market to buy the materials they use. Lending out extra money that a bank didn't have would be considered a form of counterfeiting.
They would be prohibited from creating new money at all. And they would be competing, absolutely competing without subsidy, as they have now, competing with other banks to provide a better deal.
Right.
And what this would do, it would make the banks truly competitive, which they're certainly not at the moment.
The state then deposits all their funds into their new bank and can then utilize the fractional reserve principle to their advantage by making loans to themselves for roads, bridges, etc. at no interest. When the loans are repaid, the money is extinguished from the system. The beauty of this system is you create wealth without creating a permanent increase in the money supply and the consequent inflation. Existing money is of course replaced one for one with the new debt-free money. The national debt is paid off with this new money as well, but to prevent inflation, reserve requirements are gradually raised on the commercial banks, requiring them to maintain 100% reserves. In other words, banks could then only loan out money they actually have.
The solution to our problem is clearly money put into circulation without debt. Now, it really doesn't make any difference how you do it. It's just as long as the money comes into circulation without a debt to anybody and as a payment. The very concept of the bill is to simply have the banks create the money and spend it into circulation to build the infrastructure for the state.
Actually, the state-owned bank idea is nothing new. The Bank of North Dakota is the only state-owned bank in America. It was created in 1919 as a populist movement swept through the debt-ridden farmers of the Northern Plains. Even in these worst of times, the Bank of North Dakota is earning record profits and helping fund their state. It's been doing this for the last 90 years. Hardly a radical startup idea. Community banking had been going on in Sweden for at least a century before that. These community banks increased the commonwealth instead of the big bankers' wealth. This helped Sweden grow rich, which helped Stockholm to grow into the magnificent Venice of Scandinavia that we see here today. But then the debt-based bankers attacked the savings banks.
They were under a severe attack during the 80s, but many of the saving banks still remain in the country. And they are very effective, and especially because they decentralize the power and give it back into the hands of the citizens. They empower the local communities. And in times of crisis, they have proven to be more profitable than the big banks.
Iceland's tiny economy and sparse resources were also nurtured by a series of public interest savings banks. Then the government privatized the savings banks, similar to the Swedish savings banks 20 years earlier. But in Iceland's case, even the Landsbanken, which essentially was the Bank of Iceland, was privatized as well. For the first few years, things looked good. The economy doubled. But under the surface, the private bankers were creating a huge financial bubble.
However, when the bank was privatized, it still used the good reputation of Iceland to grow huge and do, lots of criminal activities. And the owner, Björgólfur Thor, he became one of the rich boys in the world really quickly, one of the billionaires. I've seen documents linking him to the Russian mafia and his father. One oligarch that fled to the UK confirmed that Iceland was used as a money laundering machine for the Russian mafia. The income tax of more than half of the nation, just the interest of this particular loan. Then you have other loans. Then we would have gotten from in 2007 being the most developed nation in the world into a nation spending all its GDP just paying interest of foreign loans.
Foreclosures mounted, and the citizens rioted. They call it their revolution. They stormed the Parliament Square. The president was forced to call for a referendum. 93% of the people voted not to bail out the bankers.
The Brits aren't exactly as shining lights here about how to handle international relations. It's one of the worst conducted, most absurd things I've seen in a long time, really. I mean, it's obvious that the Icelandics cannot afford to pay this money back. What we've just seen is the first anti-bailout tax revolt here.
Now the ruling party is trying to convince Iceland to join the European Union to be eligible for loans to save its economy. The people, however, seem unconvinced that more and more debt is the solution. Iceland now seems determined to take back their money power and not take on more national debt.
What I want to implement here is a healthy banking system where you don't have fractional reserve, you don't have high interest. The bank should not serve as mafia outlets. It should be something that is important for the communities.
Over 70% of Iceland now opposes joining the EU, and some are now supporting proposals for cities to start up savings banks based on the Bank of North Dakota model to provide local credit and stop the rising wave of housing foreclosures.
Why are governments pumping money into private banks? Why are they not letting them roll? I mean, just like any other. And then the excuse is, oh, they're too big to fail. Let them fail. Please.
Our money is not issued by the government, even though they make it look like it is. As the inventor of the electric light, Thomas Edison, put it, if our nation can issue a dollar bond, it can issue a dollar bill. Both are promises to pay, but one promise fattens the usurers and the other helps the people. Under this system, we can never get out of debt. It's just impossible. Nor is gold-backed money the solution. You think international manipulation is easy now? Just wait until we return to a gold money system. As Thomas Edison told the New York Times, gold and money are separate things. Gold is the trick mechanism by which you can control money. That is the root of all evil. The solution is government-issued money. That's the most democratic form of money system. It maximizes freedom in a republic instead of the centralized control of the international plutocracy we are rapidly devolving into. With the power of banks diminished, politicians will become responsive to the voters once again. This privately owned money system is worldwide and is literally the primary cause of most of the world's hunger, poverty, misery, and disease. Nations of the world, the same applies to you. Virtually every nation now labors under the same monetary system. All money is created at interest, as a debt. Once again, we're falling for the bankers' threats of economic collapse, just like when Andrew Jackson tried to kill the Second Bank of the United States. It's nothing but pure extortion, world extortion. Let them fail. Remember, all this money we're giving them is at interest. Money we are borrowing to give to the banks. Then these very same banks have the audacity to loan this money back to us at more interest. This system has got to go.